Your Chancellor said last year that she would not need to come back with more tax rises, a sort of budget that she did last year. That is precisely what she has just done, and she is asking ordinary people to pay for it. 780,000 more people will be basic rate taxpayers. Those are people who were not paying income tax before. How are you helping their cost of living pressures?
No, we're setting out plans to extend a freeze at the end of this decade.
Rather than just sitting here and saying how well it's all going and how well you're doing, don't you think there is a need for some humility in all of this, which we're not hearing?
Well, I think there is a need for humility from the whole political class after the disastrous
You're
15
the
years.
now.
No, I'm going to come on.
We've
I'm
held
gonna
the
come on to
Tories. Are people better off or worse off as a result of this budget?
Well, wages have actually risen by more in the first year of this government than the first 10 years of the Conservatives. All of the fall.
And then you'll be taxing them more.
I'll come on.
It's John.
It's Lewis.
And we are in Westminster, where the circus is in full swing on budget day. There are tractors driving around Westminster, the farmers' lobby. There are pro-Europeans waving the European flag, wanting us to be back in the European Union. And so it goes on. Every corner, on every street, there's a different kind of lobby group anxious for their own particular thing to be implemented in the budget. But I cannot remember a budget which has seen such a chaotic lead up to it, with the leaks, with the kites being flown, with all the other things that have happened, particularly on whether they were going to break the manifesto pledge of raising income tax, and they backed away from that. They didn't raise the basic rate of income tax. And then to cap it all, the Office for Budget Responsibility, this body that kind of grades the government's work and the government makes its assessments on the basis of, which should kind of release its full tables of what the numbers are for growth and all the rest of it, once the Chancellor has sat down at the end of her budget, released it about 40 minutes before she stood up to speak. And it just kind of, oh my God, the inability to run a whelk stall, as Ken Clarke said to you last week, was on evidence today.
Where are these whelk stalls? No.
It used to be a thing down the East End. Whelks and jelly deals.
Yeah. Look, this is. I mean, as John was saying, the lead up to it was shambolic. The day was vaguely shambolic, but of course, that's all sort of process. What obviously matters is what was in it, what was in the budget, and this was, perhaps against expectations at some point this year, a very significant budget for lots and lots of reasons. So just to run through some of the things that Reeves announced. Big headlines. Income tax thresholds will be frozen until April 2031. That's a year longer than expected, extending the Tory freeze. We'll talk a bit more about what that means in practice in a sec. There'll be new taxes, a so-called mansion tax on homes worth more than £2 million and £5 million, basically adding extra council tax band. There'll be a mileage charge for electric vehicles. There'll be a tax on pension contributions above £2,000. There'll be changes to ISA rules for savings. The two-child benefit cap, which has been has become a bit of a shibboleth for Labour MPs. They've been desperate to reverse this George Osborne era policy, which limits benefits for families with more than two children. That will be lifted at a cost of some £3 billion. Lots of other things as well. The overall big picture is that the government's tax take will reach an all-time high of 38% of GDP in 2030-31, while growth, which of course you will remember is the thing that this government said it wanted to focus on as a means of getting out of this kind of like economic doom loop that we find ourselves in, to try and grow the size of the economy. Well, the OBR have downgraded growth forecast for every year apart from this year in the time horizon. So it's a big budget, lots and lots of tax rises, one of the most significant tax-raising budgets that we have seen, which of course comes on top of one of the most significant tax-raising budgets that we've seen, which was Rachel Reeves' last budget.
Yes, and if you compare what the Labour government have done to what they promised in the manifesto, the gap is significant. I think in the manifesto they talked about needing £8 billion worth of tax increases, and I think currently on these two budgets we've had £66 billion of tax increases.
Well, just on that, John, if there were an election tomorrow, the Institute for Fiscal Studies say that there would have been more net tax increases announced in this Parliament, which is not even 2 years old, than any other Parliament since at least 1970. So this so far has been a very significant tax-raising Parliament. The tax burden, it's a bit of a pejorative term, some people don't like it, but the sort of tax burden, for want of a better expression, is rising, and it is rising rapidly, particularly for middle-income workers.
And I suppose in the political framing of this budget, we know what the government's ambition is in the country, and they've said economic growth is the number one mission. And so you've got the audience that is the general public, us voters, and what do we think this is going to do to us? The second kind of audience are the markets and what happens to gilts and government, the cost of government borrowing. And the third market, and one not to be underestimated, is the Labour backbenchers, where you have got a government that is deeply unpopular, where the backbenchers think that Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves aren't particularly up to the job, and there's all this talk of whether there's going to be a leadership challenge and a mutiny, and it's against that backdrop that you have to look at Rachel Reeves' budget. Which of those three audiences will feel most happy at the end of today, if any at all? I would gently say probably Labour backbenchers.
Indeed, I was messaging a Labour backbencher earlier on, who I think is a pretty good barometer of the kind of mood of the Parliamentary Labour Party, which, as we know, has been sulphurous leading up to this budget. And there has been so much speculation and actual plotting that has been going on about a potential leadership challenge, either maybe some people were even saying this side of Christmas, but certainly perhaps around the elections next year. Nonetheless, I think you could see from Labour MPs that they will have been pretty happy by much of what was in that budget. This particular MP said to me, she lifted, that is the Chancellor, I texted them saying, thoughts on this? And they texted me saying, she, that is the Chancellor, lifted 500,000 children out of poverty, referring to the lifting of the two-child benefit cap. That means a lot to Labour MPs. It is sort of almost talismanic for them at this point. And indeed, we should say, the two-child benefit cap has been a deeply damaging policy for hundreds of thousands of children across the country. It has made their plight, their living in poverty, worse. And there is a powerful moral argument to lift it, in the sense that it hasn't done what it's been intended to do, which was to limit the size of bigger families who are on benefits. But also, as the Chancellor herself said, there is why should it be that children who are growing up in poverty should pay a penalty, already starting out at such a disadvantage in life by comparison to their relative peers, perhaps for mistakes that their parents may or may not have made. But that is not how the country sees the welfare, the two-child benefit limit.
Well, let's just play that clip of Rachel Reeves in the budget, because I think until that moment, the Commons had been kind of a lot of harumphing and hurrahing and whatever else, but it was kind of just noise until that she made that particular announcement.
I can announce today, fully costed and fully funded, the removal of the two-child limit in full from April. We on this side of the house. It's amazing what people get so angry about, and we've seen their true colours today. The thing they get angry about is lifting children out of poverty.
And you could see a kind of loads of hands up waving order papers in support on the Labour backbenchers. And the important thing about this is, Lewis, the moral argument you make is sort of, absolutely profound and unarguable. But in the country, actually, there was no great demand for this particular policy. I think that the two-child cap kind of enjoyed considerable support. So, the old Harold Wilson quote, Labour is a moral crusade or it is nothing. You could see that there was a bit of the moral crusade there. And the other thing that struck me is, there was all these talk of all these Blairites going into Downing Street to take up key positions, and whether this would be a Blairite kind of new Labour budget. No way. This is as old Labour as they come. And I thought Kemi Badenoch sort of hit the mark when she said, this is a budget for Benefit Street.
And I think that is the political danger for this budget, which is, look, I think the net result of this budget is that, at least for the short term, I think it will consolidate and shore up Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer within the Parliamentary Labour Party, because the two-child benefit cap has come to occupy such a central place in the political interests of so many Labour MPs. I think it nonetheless may weaken their external political position in the country. And of course, the latter will eventually feed into the former, because if the polling situation continues to decline, then of course Labour MPs will get nervous. Ultimately, there is a real danger, I think, that the Labour Party is very easily framed as a result of this budget as the welfare party, which is always a danger for Labour governments. And I say that for two reasons. Whatever, as I say, the moral arguments of the two-child benefit cap, which I am personally sympathetic to, it is problematic to lift it at a moment where two other things are happening. Number one, the welfare bill overall continues in a completely unsustainable way to explode and to rise and rise and rise. Indeed, the OBR says in this document that their estimates for total welfare spending will be some 16 billion higher than they thought it would be at the end of the forecast horizon in a few years' time, than they thought it would be in March, 9 months ago. That is the extent to which spending, particularly on health-related and disability-related welfare spending, is continuing to rise and to rise and to rise. This government tried to do something about that. They did it in a very cack-handed, bad way, but they tried to do something about it and they retreated because the Labour MPs wouldn't tolerate it. So difficult to do it in that circumstance, and difficult as well to do it at a moment when you are making a substantial set of tax rises on people on modest incomes, because they are freezing income tax thresholds. So people who are perhaps weren't paying tax before or weren't paying the higher rate of tax before will find themselves in higher tax brackets, and they are basically being asked to pay more tax, partly to pay for a welfare benefits bill which is spiralling out of control. That is it's fodder for Labour opponents. So easy for the Tories and even for the Reform Party as well. And I would be pretty nervous about that if I were a Labour MP.
And the other thing that will get a lot of the headlines tonight and tomorrow is this sort of so-called mansion tax, which Labour are very proud to say, look, and again, it's all about redistribution and, hitting the rich and benefiting the poor, and say, how is it fair that someone in a housing estate somewhere or other is paying the same as someone who lives in a £10 million house in Mayfair? And so they're going to introduce the mansion tax, but it's going to raise a sort of relatively paltry £400 million, theoretically. That's before you've tried to implement it and you've had the upgrading of properties and the council tax bans, which will present all sorts of difficulties along the way. And what will get hardly any coverage tonight, even though it's a ton more significant, is the salary sacrifice changes to people's pensions, which is going to raise £4 billion, so 10 times the amount of money. But because it's kind of slightly obscure and you have to understand the details of it, people are not going to pay much attention to it. But that is going to hit people really hard in terms of, people who are trying to save for their pensions and their retirements. And I just wonder whether the mansion tax thing, it sounds good, but is it actually going to raise a lot of money? Is it worth the effort that it's going to cost to implement?
I suspect that when it finally comes for it to be rolled out, that it will potentially be in a situation after it's sort of been consulted and the reforms where it either doesn't get rolled out in the first place, or the amount of money that it raises is pretty nugatory. And we already see that it's only forecast to raise 400 million, which sounds like a lot of money, but in Treasury terms isn't very much money at all. And that only has to go down a little bit before it raises. I mean, it almost becomes not worth sort of raising. And again, I suppose this is my sort of wider frustration in a way. We've spoken on the show before. I think that there is a very strong case to move to greater wealth taxation and to reduce income taxation. I think there is a strong case for reform of property taxation in this country. But again, this feels like it's just sort of the classic patch and mend way that the Treasury and the governments come along and do, and it sounds sort of good on the surface, but actually in the end doesn't take you very far and isn't very comprehensive and isn't very well thought out. Whilst at the same time, as I say, and I do think it's just worth dwelling on this, at the same time, we are moving to a situation where the state, the government, is going to be taking more and more money, not from rich people, I mean, it will be doing that, but actually the focus on this budget really, in terms of the in terms of income taxation at least, it's not really touching the sort of poorest that much. In terms of income taxation, it's not targeting the richest very much, although there are some other things that sort of target the rich. This is, if you're in the sort of middle third, in that sort of middle group, then this is, pretty damaging for you over the long term. And what I'd say is that the fiscal creep that we've seen, the changes to income tax thresholds, and just to explain what that means, basically, if you don't increase with inflation the threshold at which you start to pay income tax, but your wages do go up with inflation, then you find yourself paying higher rates of tax than you otherwise would have done. And what Rachel Reeves announced today is an extension by several years of those thresholds, which started under the Conservatives, and this is basically going to go on for 10 years now, more or less. Those thresholds are not going to go up. And that basically is maybe the biggest tax increase from a single policy that we've seen in history. It's going to transform our tax base. If you think about, just to sort of illustrate it, if you go back to sort of the, even you only have to go back to about 2015 or so to find that the higher rate of tax was only being paid by about 8 to 9% of people. That is forecast to go up to nearly 20% of people. When it was first introduced, the higher rate of tax, the 40p in the pound by Nigel Lawson in the late 80s, when it was reduced to 40p, only about 3% of people in the country were paying it. I.e., the higher rate of tax used to be a rate of tax for really quite rich people. It will now be being paid by people on pretty relatively modest incomes. And that is a transformation in our tax system, which is here to stay. As I say, it started under the Tories, but Rachel Reeves has embedded it, expanded it, and consolidated it today.
I do think that this budget, you've talked about the dangers for Labour as being seen as the sort of welfare state party. I do think this creates an opportunity for the Conservative Party in terms of, big government versus small government. I think that, Paul Johnson, former head of the IFS, said, look, this is a historic change to the size of the state, what is being announced today. And you can see that on the Conservative Party's right, you've got Reform, but Reform quite like welfare. They've turned into a bit of a welfare-loving party where they want to have all these benefits and all these state handouts for everyone. And so you've got Reform liking big welfare spending. You've got Labour liking a lot of welfare spending. You could see the reinvention of the Tories as a Thatcherite party and say, we have got to stop the ballooning size of the state, the amount of money that we are taking from taxpayers to fund these big projects, and we've got a fundamental reform. And I think that Kemi Badenoch has got a space now where people were saying, well, what's she for? And what is the Tory argument? I think their argument gets stronger as a result of today. Well, we're joined in the studio now by Torsten Bell, Treasury Minister, and who played a key role in the preparations for this budget. We'll come on to the detail in a second. But I honestly cannot remember a more shambolic kind of lead up to a budget in terms of kites flown, kites brought down, U-turns on U-turns, taxes were going to go up, you were going to break the manifesto, you're not going to break the manifesto, and then culminating today, and I know it's not your fault, in the OBR leaking all the vital details before Rachel Reeves stands up. Would you agree it has been shambolic?
Well, it's lucky for you that you can now get on with discussing the substance of what's in the budget, John, because if you found that, I can understand people have found some of that difficult, and the OBR will need to look seriously at what happened with their publication early today.
Would you say it has been confusing, it has been misleading, it has been dispiriting in terms of investment for this country?
No, I wouldn't accept that, John, but as I say, the Chancellor's now laid out a budget, so let's get on with discussing what's in it.
OK. Key proposal I want to discuss with you. Welfare spending by 29-30 is going to be £16 billion higher than was forecast in March. Whatever happened to welfare reform?
Well, lots is happening, John. We've already set out plans to change universal credit to deal with the problem the Tories left, which they built a welfare system that wrote millions off as too sick to work, and we're already reforming that. And if you look at what the Office for Budget Responsibility say today, they say tens of thousands of people will move into work as a result. We're also setting out plans for a job guarantee so that young people will be offered a job, but they cannot stay on benefits if they choose not to take it. We've also setting out changes to the tax relief for the Motability Scheme, who are also removing expensive vehicles. You used to be able to, under the
So
Conservatives...
why is the welfare bill rising and rising and rising? And it will be £406 billion will be spent on welfare, 11.2% of GDP.
No, John, right. So the reason why there are challenges in the welfare system is because the Tories built a welfare system that wrote millions off as too sick to work and left children too poor to eat. And we are getting on with changing it. I'm not defending the welfare system that exists. We're getting on with changing it. I've given you some of the things we've done there. We've also have a review of personal independence payments being done by my colleague in the Department for Work and Pensions. The welfare system does need to change. We cannot have children growing up in poverty in the rates we have, but we also can't have as many being written off as too sick to work. And things are changing.
The truth is, Torsten, isn't it, that actually the reason you're not reforming the welfare system with greater speed and greater enthusiasm is simply because you're too afraid of your own backbenchers who don't want it to happen.
No, I've set out some of the changes we're already making. As I say, look in the Office for Budget Responsibilities document today, and it sets out that many people more will be going into work because we've started to reform the system. If you're
John's right, 16 billion a year higher since March. That's what the forecast is saying. So given that the cost is clearly spiralling out of control quickly because it's only been 8 to 9 months since March, don't you need to start to reform welfare on a more substantial basis now?
Well, let me deal with a few of those points. So first of all, we are starting to reform the system already. But if you're saying to me, will there be more to be done? Yes, there.
Well, you're waiting for Stephen Timms
wait
to
a
come
second.
back.
You've asked a question. I'm going to give you the answer to your question. You just said that welfare spending is spiralling. Actually, the number of people coming on to claim personal independence has fallen this year compared to last year. Look at the Office of Budget Responsibilities forecast for incapacity benefits. It shows that the growth in that spending is actually falling by 3/4 compared to the growth under the Conservatives over the last Parliament. So I know that's what the Conservatives want to say, and it's fair enough.
The OBR says that the welfare spending forecast will be 16 billion higher a year compared to what you thought it would be, or they thought it would be in March.
What the Office of Budget Responsibility say is that welfare spending under this Parliament is actually flat as a share of GDP, having gone up significantly under the Conservatives. That's what it says. But if you're asking me, do we have a failing welfare system? The answer is yes, and that is why we're changing it.
But just to Lewis's point about you're scared of your backbenchers, you tried welfare reform in the summer. You have a huge majority and you could not get it through. It was a humiliation for Keir Starmer and it was a humiliation for the government.
We've announced further welfare
Would
reforms.
you agree?
No, we've announced further welfare reforms just today. And the idea that this is a government ducking the difficult decisions. Look what has been announced on tax today.
U-turned.
Wait a second. Look at the decisions announced by the Chancellor today. Many of the big reforms to the tax system that everybody has known needed to happen announced under this Chancellor, and as a result, what we have to ask ordinary workers to contribute is kept as low as possible. What the Conservatives who are opposing today's budget are defending is a property tax system that lets somebody in a normal terraced house in Blackpool paying higher property taxes than someone in a £10 million house in Westminster. So we are delivering the big reforms that are necessary, and we're doing it so that we can make sure we've got public services that are functioning once again. Remember, disastrous austerity, waiting lists going through the roof, potholes not being filled in are not just bad for the communities over the last 15 years. They have undermined our economy too. So we are not going to go back to austerity. We are going to make the necessary and fair choices to mean that we can get energy bills down, get waiting lists down, and get borrowing down every single year.
Who said that fiscal drag hurts working people because it takes more money out of their pay slips?
Well, the Chancellor's been very, very straightforward in the Commons today.
The Chancellor said that. She was Shadow Chancellor.
Well, I've literally just said that, Lewis. What the Chancellor has done today is be very clear that we are asking everybody to make a contribution. But the difference in her choices are that we can keep that contribution as low as possible because we are making the big reforms to the tax system that mean that we can make those with the broader shoulders contribute more.
Would you say that fiscal drag does hurt or does make cost of living pressures worse?
Well, the freezes to the tax thresholds that are happening this year and next year and the year after were put in place by the last Conservative government. In fact, 75% of the revenue being raised by tax freezes follows from the Conservative Party's policies. But if you're asking me to be honest with the British people that we are asking them to make a contribution, then the answer is yes. Towards the end of this Parliament, we are extending the freezes.
And that will make cost of living pressures worse.
Well, no, what will make cost of living pressures better right now is that we're cutting energy bills by £150 for everybody and rising to £300 for some of the poorest people in this country. And what will make the cost of living pressure for poor families, remember, who are majority working, is getting rid of the terrible 2-child limit that has plunged hundreds of thousands of children into poverty. And as a result of those decisions today, this Parliament is set to see the biggest fall in child poverty of any Parliament on record.
And what it also means is we are going to see one of the most profound restructuring of our tax base and tax system that we have ever seen, something that the Conservatives started, you criticised in opposition, and are now extending and embedding. As a result of what you've announced today, 780,000 more people will be basic rate taxpayers. Those are people who were not paying income tax before. How are you helping their cost of living pressures? You're making them pay tax for the first time.
No, we're setting out plans to extend a freeze
that
at the
is true.
end of this decade. And what we're setting out is fairer reforms of the tax system that mean we can minimise the contribution from ordinary workers. And we're also setting out measures to provide real help with the cost of living right now. That's happening on energy bills. It's also happening on rail fares with the first freeze in 30 years. We're freezing prescription charges as well. We're pushing back we are extending the 5p temporary cut to fuel duty. That will save people £49 off their petrol prices
Your Chancellor said last year that she would not need to come back with more tax rises, a sort of budget that she did last year. That is precisely what she has just done, and she is asking ordinary people to pay for it, to pay for her failure to control welfare spending, to control spending overall, and to get growth going in this economy, which is what you said you would do.
And we have. We've beaten the forecast on growth.
Well,
Wait a second, because you keep repeating that. I've heard you say that on the show before, and it's factually inaccurate. Growth this year was forecast to be 1%, and today it is forecast to be 1%.
Been downgraded
I'm going to come on to the forecasts, but let's focus on the facts of what's actually happened in our country. Over the last year, growth has been much faster than people expected. It's now being confirmed by the OBR that they expect it to be 1.5% for this year. From 1%, I'm going to answer the question, 1%. Compared to 1% back in March. It is true that the Office of Budget Responsibility have said that their longer-term productivity forecasts have been downgraded. And look at why they say that has happened. Because of the disastrous legacy of a Tory government that saw growth flatline year after year after year. So in the years where you can see the actual impact of a Labour government, growth is up.
In which case,
if you're saying to me, do we need to double down on our measures to support growth because of the downgrade on productivity? Absolutely.
Indeed, so.
And that is what, absolutely, and that's why we're announcing measures today to help start-up firms in Britain to scale up further. It's why we haven't raised corporation tax, sticking to our promise to keep it at the lowest level in the G7.
So why does the OBR say that this budget doesn't do anything for growth?
No, the OBR has a technical comment there, but it's for governments to defend
the
the
OBR
impact
says
of their
we have
policies.
assessed that none of the policy measures in this budget have a sufficiently material impact to justify adjusting our post measures potential output forecast. I.e., there is nothing in this budget that does anything new for growth, and on top of that, they're not even assessing yet the impact of the Employment Rights Bill, which they do predict is likely to have a deleterious impact on growth in the years ahead.
No, they don't say that, but. That's not right, and that's a technical comment about their thresholds for adjusting the impact of measures.
What does this budget do for growth?
Let's focus on the substance. Let's do what it does for growth. We've kept corporation tax at its current low. We're bringing down borrowing every single year. We are cutting inflation directly next year to help the Bank of England, which has already cut interest rates by 5 percentage points, keep them falling, and that will bring down mortgage costs for households, but it also will give businesses the confidence to invest. We have also done what previous chancellors never did, which is to protect capital investment, which the OBR last year said was driving growth significantly, 120 billion extra over the course of these 5 years, to make sure that we do not make the future growth of Britain the thing that is sacrificed in the face of difficult circumstances.
Torsten, you're putting up a very trenchant defence of the government, as we would expect you to do. But look, everyone knows that this is a really tough budget, that taxes are going up. You promised last year that it would be a one-off, one and done. That's what Rachel Reeves came and said to us on the newsagents, and you've come back for a massive increase more. Rather than just sitting here and saying how well it's all going and how well you're doing, don't you think there is a need for some humility in all of this, which we're not hearing?
Well, I think there is a need for humility from the whole political class after the disastrous 15 years.
Now.
I'm going to come on.
We've
I'm
held
going to
the
come on to the
Tories.
government.
We've held. Look, come on. When we get Tories in here, we hold them to account and we hold their feet to the flames over their record. Your record now is that it was one and done last year. I can't see the significant world-shattering event that's taken place in the last year. Rachel Reeves promised it was one and done, and you've come back for a massive amount more, and people are thinking, well, maybe next year she'll do the same again.
Well, you're right to say that there was a budget last year. Since then, we've seen growth come in stronger than was expected. But if you're asking me, have we learnt over the course of the 16 months of this government that delivering change is harder than everyone would like? Yes. But what are we doing today? Setting out that we are committed to delivering that change immediately. So in the longer term, yes, you see the benefits to growth for that capital investment I mentioned earlier. But right now, we are going to be reducing the cost of living, bringing down energy bills in March, because people do need to see that the change we promised is happening. It's why we have to keep waiting lists falling, because people need to see public services that work. And they need to see that, not just because it's the right thing for our society, but because it's the right thing for our economy. If you have a collapsing NHS, then workers can't go to work. If you do not provide decent neighbourhood police, then supermarkets end up paying more to have security guards on their door.
Can you promise you won't come back with another one?
Look, what we've set out today, it's a fair question to ask why are taxes going up? And the answer is because the British public have had enough of public services that are collapsing. And we cannot carry on like that.
So let me ask you this simple question. Should the average worker, having listened to this, feel better off or worse off as a result of this budget? And Lewis talked about the numbers, that there are going to be 780,000 more taxpayers with the basic rate, 920,000 more taxpayers will pay the higher rate.
Well, he's referring to changes driven mainly by the Conservative Party's previous
I'm just
policies.
asking the straight question.
No, that's
Let
fine.
me just answer the straight question, which is quite simple. Are people better off or worse off as a result of this budget?
Well, wages have actually risen by more in the first year of this government than the first 10 years of the Conservatives. All of the fall...
And then you'll be taxing them more.
Come on. All of the fall in household incomes in the last Parliament, a completely unprecedented fall, has already been wiped out by rising incomes under this government. But if you're saying is there a lot more to do, absolutely. No one is pretending there is not. And we are doing that. That is why energy bills are being cut. That is why prescription charges are being frozen.
Would you come back with another budget like this?
Well, we're talking about the budget we're actually doing
But
today.
Rachel
And
Reeves said
earlier, your colleague was complaining about the level of pre-budget speculation. It's any excuse not to discuss the actual budget.
No, we've discussed the budget.
I'm not talking about future budgets. I'm talking about
Well,
this
Rachel
budget.
Reeves promised that she wouldn't come back with one, and then she did. So I'm just wondering whether you're going to rule out coming back with
Well,
another
what we
tax-raising
are doing is making sure that we are doubling down on growth, but also making sure that we're cutting borrowing every single year and doubling the headroom against our fiscal rules to provide stability to the public finances.
One very quick last thing. Do you think the OBR needs to be reformed, given what we've seen today? Is it time to change the way it operates?
The OBR is going to have to think very seriously about what happened today.
And do you think it should be reformed?
Let's wait and see. But the OBR is going to need to think very seriously about what happened today. That was an incredibly serious breach of the budget process.
Is the Chancellor angry about it?
No, look, the Chancellor's getting on with delivering her budget.
Grateful to you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Inevitably, on a big budget day like today, there's going to be a lot of criticism, a lot of critique, including on this show. I suppose it is worth thinking about kind of if you're sat in number 11 or the Treasury, what's the really positive case, and what do they think might have gone well? And of course we might not know that today because budgets often unravel on day 2 or day 3, or in this case day -3 or day -4. But I think the best case scenario I think for this budget is to say we've already alluded to one. They shore up their internal position, which ain't nothing, right? If you're a politician, you can't secure the future for your government if you're no longer in government, and that has been looking less and less certain. They have, as I say, done Labour things, the good Labour things they can sell. They're increasing state pension, they're increasing minimum wage. Business won't like that, but Labour MPs will, and it's something that they can sell on the doorstep. There is a 2-child benefit cap, as we say. They're maintaining investment in the NHS, which is again something that they can sell. You can see the outlines of a sharper political message, focusing on waiting lists, focusing on bringing debt down, focusing on living standards, and so on. And she has, and I think this is probably the thing that won't get much attention, but I think is wise from her point of view. She has left herself more fiscal headroom, so-called, i.e. more room to play with in future budgets, 22 billion, doubling where she was before. She could have chosen not to do that, so she could sort of leaven the pain in this budget, but she's clearly made a decision to do that, partly because I think she knows she doesn't want to go through this process again. She wants the markets to know, and there's another positive thing, the markets have responded reasonably well. She wants the markets to know she's got headroom. She wants Labour MPs to know she's got headroom. And there's the possibility that the OBR in future budgets, particularly as we get closer to the election, might do what they actually did in this budget, which is actually say things aren't quite as bad as we thought on the tax receipts front, and she actually ends up with a really quite sizable spending pot that she could perhaps use for a few little sweeteners and giveaways as we get closer to budgets in the future and getting closer to the general election.
So I listened to Kemi Badenoch at Prime Minister's questions and then in response to the budget, and I think we were both saying that she's got a lot better as a Commons performer, but she went over the top and she said that Rachel Reeves is going to go down as the worst Chancellor in history. Well, no. The reaction to this budget is nothing like what happened when Liz Truss was the Prime Minister and the Kamikaze budget of Kwasi Kwarteng. That was infinitely worse, and the reaction of the markets was infinitely worse. I've been speaking to a couple of senior people, and they've been talking about 1981. The Geoffrey Howe budget of 1981, when the Tories had been in power for 2 years, Thatcher was the Prime Minister, and they came in with a tax-raising budget at a time which flew in the face of Keynesian orthodoxy, which was at a time of recession, you don't raise taxes, you want to stimulate growth. And of course, the economy, now there was a Falklands War that came a year later, which helped Margaret Thatcher enormously. But their idea that you do tough things now and maybe there may be a pot of gold a bit later on, I think is what is in the minds of an awful lot of Treasury people who've got long memories and kind of, a sense of history about these things, that this is something that, it's uncomfortable today. The headlines are not going to be pretty tomorrow, but maybe when Labour is coming to fight the next election, things will feel a good deal better than they do right now.
And we'll see what happens on day 2.
We'll be back tomorrow. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.